What if I told you that in the summer of 2001, a woman vanished from a quiet suburban neighborhood, and for 22 years, everyone believed she was dead? What if I told you that the man who claimed to love her most was the one who made her disappear? And what if I told you that the truth, when it finally surfaced, was more shocking than anyone could have imagined? This is the story of Leslie Prieur, a woman who became a ghost in her own life, a mother who lost everything, and a survivor who refused to let her story end the way others had written it. But before I tell you how she came back from the dead, I need to tell you how she got there in the first place. And trust me, you're going to want to stay until the very end, because the twist in this story will change everything you think you know about justice, about love, and about what one woman can endure when the world turns its back on her. If this story moves you, if it makes you feel something, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button and share this video. Not for me, but for Leslie. Because her story deserves to be heard by millions, and you have the power to make that happen. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Leslie Prieur was born in 1965 in a small town in Northern California, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and your business. Her parents were working-class people, her father a mechanic and her mother a seamstress who took in alterations to make ends meet. Leslie was the middle child of 5, sandwiched between 2 older brothers and 2 younger sisters. From the time she could walk, she was the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over arguments and made sure everyone had what they needed. Her mother used to say that Leslie had an old soul, that she carried the weight of the world on her small shoulders without ever complaining. Growing up, Leslie was quiet but fiercely intelligent. She devoured books, spending hours at the local library reading everything from mystery novels to encyclopedias. She dreamed of becoming a teacher, of standing in front of a classroom and opening young minds to the wonders of the world. But dreams, as Leslie would learn, have a way of getting derailed by circumstance. At 16, Leslie met a boy named Marcus Prieur. He was 2 years older, handsome, charming, and from one of the wealthier families in town. His father owned a chain of auto dealerships, and Marcus drove a brand new car to school every year. To Leslie, who had grown up counting pennies and wearing hand-me-downs, Marcus represented everything she had never had: stability, security, a future without struggle. Marcus pursued Leslie with relentless determination. He showed up at her house with flowers, wrote her love letters, and promised her the world. Her parents were suspicious at first, wondering why a boy from such a different background would be interested in their daughter. But Marcus was patient and persistent. He won them over with his easy smile and his willingness to sit at their modest dinner table and eat whatever was served without complaint. By the time Leslie graduated high school in 1983, she and Marcus were engaged. Her dreams of college and teaching faded into the background, replaced by wedding plans and the promise of a life she had never dared to imagine for herself. Marcus told her she didn't need to work, that he would take care of everything. At 18 years old, Leslie believed him. They married in the fall of 1983, in a ceremony that was the talk of the town. Leslie wore a white dress that cost more than her father made in a month, and she walked down the aisle feeling like Cinderella at the ball. She had no idea that the glass slipper was already beginning to crack. The first few years of marriage were good, or at least Leslie convinced herself they were. Marcus worked at his father's dealerships, and they lived in a beautiful house on a tree-lined street. Leslie decorated it with care, turning it into a home she was proud of. In 1986, she gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Emma. 2 years later, their son Michael arrived. Leslie threw herself into motherhood with the same dedication she had once given to her studies. She read parenting books, joined mothers' groups, and made sure her children had everything she hadn't growing up. But behind closed doors, the fairy tale was beginning to unravel. Marcus, who had seemed so attentive during their courtship, grew distant after the children were born. He worked late, traveled often, and when he was home, he was irritable and critical. Nothing Leslie did was ever good enough. The house was never clean enough. The meals were never quite right. The children were too loud, too demanding, too much. At first, Leslie made excuses for him. He was under pressure at work. His father expected too much. He was tired. She told herself that all marriages had rough patches, that things would get better if she just tried harder, loved harder, gave more of herself. But the more she gave, the more Marcus took, until there was almost nothing left of the woman she had once been. The verbal criticism slowly escalated into something darker. Marcus began to control every aspect of Leslie's life. He monitored her phone calls, questioned her about every purchase, and isolated her from her friends and family. Her parents noticed the change in their daughter, the way she flinched at sudden movements, the way she always looked over her shoulder, the way her laughter had disappeared. But when they tried to ask about it, Leslie insisted everything was fine. She had become an expert at hiding the truth, at painting a picture of a perfect life that existed only in her imagination. By the mid-1990s, Leslie was a shell of herself. She had given up everything for Marcus, her dreams, her independence, her sense of self. And in return, he had given her a prison disguised as a marriage. But she stayed. She stayed for Emma and Michael, who adored their father and had no idea what happened behind closed doors. She stayed because she had nowhere else to go, no money of her own, no skills that would support her children. She stayed because Marcus had convinced her, over years of careful manipulation, that she was worthless without him, that no one else would ever want her, that she should be grateful he put up with her at all. And then, in the spring of 2001, everything changed. Leslie discovered something that would alter the course of her life forever, something that would force her to make a choice between survival and surrender. And the choice she made would lead to her disappearance, to the rumors, to the whispers, and to a truth that wouldn't surface for more than 2 decades. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because to understand what happened to Leslie Prior, you need to understand the moment she decided to fight back. And that moment, my friends, is where our story truly begins. The spring of 2001 arrived in California with its usual promise of renewal. The cherry blossoms bloomed along the streets of the Prior neighborhood, and the air carried that particular scent of possibility that comes with warmer days. But inside the beautiful house on Maple Drive, there was no renewal, no possibility, only the same suffocating routine that Leslie had endured for nearly 18 years. By this point, Emma was 15 and Michael was 13. They were good kids, smart and kind, but they had learned to navigate their father's moods just as Leslie had. They knew when to be quiet, when to disappear to their rooms, when to pretend they didn't hear the cutting remarks their father made to their mother. It broke Leslie's heart to see them adapting to dysfunction, learning patterns that would take years to unlearn. But she told herself it was better than the alternative, better than a broken home, better than the stigma of divorce. That April, Marcus announced he would be traveling to Chicago for a business conference. He would be gone for a week, the longest trip he had taken in years. Leslie felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief because his absence meant peace, meant she could breathe without fear of criticism. Anxiety because she knew from experience that his returns were often worse than his departures, that he would find fault with everything that had happened in his absence. On the 3rd day of Marcus's trip, Leslie was cleaning his home office, something she rarely did because he kept it locked when he was home. But he had left in a hurry, and the door was unlocked. She told herself she was just dusting, just tidying up. But something drew her to his desk, to the drawer he always kept locked. The key, she knew, was hidden behind a false panel in his closet. She had discovered it years ago, but had never dared to use it. That day, something was different. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of years of silence. Maybe it was the look on Emma's face when Marcus had snapped at her before leaving. Maybe it was the woman Leslie glimpsed in the mirror that morning, a woman she barely recognized. Whatever it was, it gave her the courage to retrieve the key and open that drawer. What she found inside changed everything. There were documents, dozens of them. Bank statements for accounts Leslie had never known existed, accounts in Marcus's name alone, containing hundreds of thousands of dollars. There were receipts for purchases she had never seen, jewelry, vacations, a car. And there were photographs. Photographs of Marcus with another woman, a younger woman, smiling and embracing in locations Leslie recognized from trips Marcus had supposedly taken alone. But that wasn't the worst of it. Beneath the photographs, there was a folder labeled with a name, Prier Family Trust. Inside, Leslie found documents that took her hours to understand. Legal papers that revealed Marcus had been systematically transferring their shared assets into accounts and investments that excluded her entirely. If they were to divorce, Leslie would be left with nothing. The house was in a trust she couldn't access. The cars were leased to the business. Even the children's college funds had been structured in a way that gave Marcus complete control. She sat on the floor of his office, papers spread around her, and for the first time in years, Leslie Prier allowed herself to truly feel. The betrayal washed over her in waves, followed by a rage so intense it frightened her. This man she had given her life to, had been planning for years to discard her like yesterday's newspaper. He had been building an escape route while trapping her in a cage of financial dependence. But it was the final document in the folder that made her blood run cold. It was a letter, handwritten, from Marcus to his attorney. In it, he outlined his concerns about Leslie's mental health, describing episodes of erratic behavior that had never occurred, claiming she had become a danger to herself and the children. He was asking about the process for involuntary psychiatric commitment and about how such a commitment would affect custody arrangements. Leslie understood then, with perfect clarity, what Marcus was planning. He wasn't just going to leave her. He was going to destroy her. He was going to take her children, her reputation, her freedom. He was going to have her committed to a psychiatric facility, and he was going to walk away with everything while she rotted in an institution, labeled crazy and dangerous by the man who had created that narrative from whole cloth. She had perhaps days, maybe weeks, before he put this plan into action. The conference in Chicago, she now realized, was probably a meeting with lawyers and doctors, people who would help him execute his scheme. She had to act, and she had to act fast. That night, after the children were in bed, Leslie sat at the kitchen table and made a list. She wrote down everything she could remember about their finances, every account number she had seen, every name that had appeared on those documents. She photocopied everything in that drawer, working quietly with the ancient copier Marcus kept in the garage, the one he thought she didn't know how to use. She hid the copies in a place she knew he would never look. Inside an old box of her mother's things that Marcus had always dismissed as sentimental clutter. Over the next 3 days, Leslie transformed. The timid, beaten-down woman who had accepted her fate for so many years disappeared, replaced by someone she barely recognized. She opened a secret bank account, depositing small amounts of cash she had managed to save over the years, money Marcus didn't know about. She contacted a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chun, who specialized in cases of domestic abuse and financial manipulation. And she began to document everything, writing down every cruel word, every controlling behavior, every moment of the psychological torture she had endured. When Marcus returned from Chicago, Leslie greeted him with her usual smile, playing the role of the dutiful wife with an expertise born of years of practice. He had no idea that the woman who served him dinner that night was not the same woman he had left a week ago. He had no idea that Leslie had seen behind the curtain, that she knew exactly what he was planning, and that she was already 3 steps ahead of him. The game had changed, and for the first time in her marriage, Leslie Prier was the one making the rules. The weeks following Marcus's return were the most dangerous of Leslie's life. She walked a tightrope every day, maintaining the facade of the obedient wife while secretly building her case for freedom. Patricia Chun, her lawyer, had warned her that leaving an abuser was the most perilous time, that men like Marcus often escalated to violence when they sensed they were losing control. Leslie lived with that knowledge like a stone in her stomach, heavy and constant. She continued to gather evidence. She recorded conversations when she could, using a small tape recorder Patricia had given her. She took photographs of bruises when Marcus grabbed her too hard, documenting injuries she had always hidden before. She made copies of financial documents whenever she could access them, building a paper trail that would prove Marcus's fraud and deception. Emma and Michael noticed something different about their mother, though they couldn't quite name it. She seemed more present, more focused, like she was paying attention to things she had ignored for years. Leslie wanted to tell them what was happening, wanted to prepare them for the storm that was coming. But she knew she couldn't risk it. Children, even well-meaning ones, could let things slip. And if Marcus found out what she was planning, everything would be lost. In early May, Leslie met with Patricia to review the evidence she had gathered. The lawyer's face grew more serious with each document she examined. The financial manipulation alone, she said, could constitute grounds for fraud. Combined with Leslie's documentation of emotional abuse and the letter about psychiatric commitment, they had the makings of a strong case. But Patricia warned Leslie that men like Marcus didn't give up easily. He had money, connections, and a reputation in the community. He would fight dirty. What Leslie didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Marcus was already suspicious. He had noticed small things, a receipt left in the wrong place, a document slightly out of order. He hadn't connected the dots yet, but he was watching, waiting, sensing that something in his carefully controlled world was shifting. The breaking point came on May 15, 2001. Marcus came home early from work and found Leslie on the phone with Patricia. She ended the call quickly, claiming it was a friend from her old book club, but something in her voice must have given her away. That night, after the children were asleep, Marcus confronted her in the kitchen. "Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this before we continue. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew the truth could set you free, but might also destroy everything you'd built? Have you ever had to choose between safety and honesty? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know your story, because what happened next to Leslie might resonate with more of you than you realize." Marcus stood between Leslie and the door, his face twisted into an expression she had learned to fear over the years. He accused her of lying, of plotting behind his back, of being ungrateful for everything he had given her. He demanded to know who she had been talking to, what she was planning. For a moment, Leslie considered telling him everything, throwing the evidence in his face and watching his smug certainty crumble. But Patricia's warnings echoed in her mind, and she knew that confrontation would only put her in more danger. So she lied. She apologized, cried, begged for forgiveness for making him suspicious. She played the role of the repentant wife so perfectly that Marcus eventually calmed down, convinced that his display of dominance had worked. But as he walked away, satisfied with his power, Leslie made a decision. She couldn't wait any longer. The evidence she had gathered would have to be enough. She had to get out before Marcus discovered the truth. The plan she developed over the next 24 hours was audacious and terrifying. She would take the children and leave while Marcus was at work, driving to her sister's house 3 hours away. From there, Patricia would file emergency papers for a protective order and begin divorce proceedings. It was risky, but staying was riskier. On May 17th, Leslie put the plan into motion. She packed suitcases for herself and the children, hiding them in the garage behind boxes of Christmas decorations. She withdrew the maximum amount from the secret bank account and hid the cash in her purse. She arranged for Emma and Michael to come straight home after school, telling them she had a surprise planned. But at 2 p.m., as Leslie was making final preparations, the front door opened. Marcus walked in, hours before he should have been home, and found his wife with car keys in her hand and fear in her eyes. The next few minutes unfolded like a nightmare. Marcus's face went from surprise to understanding to rage in seconds. He blocked her exit, demanding to know what she was doing, where she thought she was going. Leslie tried to stay calm, tried to defuse the situation, but Marcus was beyond reason. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. And then, for the first time in 18 years of marriage, Leslie fought back. She twisted away from him, pushing him hard enough that he stumbled backward. She ran for the door, made it outside, was almost to her car when he caught her again. The neighbors later told police they heard screaming, but no one came outside to help. No one wanted to get involved in someone else's domestic dispute. What happened in the next hour remained unclear for years. The only thing anyone knew for certain was that by the time the children came home from school, the house was empty. Leslie's car was still in the driveway. Her purse was on the kitchen counter. The suitcases were in the garage. But Leslie Prier was gone. Marcus called the police that evening, reporting his wife missing. He played the role of the concerned husband perfectly, describing how she had been acting strangely, how he had come home to find her confused and disoriented, how she had run off before he could help her. The police, lacking any evidence of foul play, treated it as a missing person case. They searched the neighborhood, the nearby parks, the hospital emergency rooms. They found nothing. In the weeks that followed, the investigation slowly ground to a halt. There were no witnesses to what had happened in that house, no evidence of violence that couldn't be explained away. Marcus hired a private investigator who issued statements expressing the family's desperate hope for Leslie's safe return. The community rallied around him, this poor man whose troubled wife had abandoned him and their children. And just like that, Leslie Prior disappeared from the world. The years that followed Leslie's disappearance were a study in two different kinds of hell. For Emma and Michael, it was the hell of not knowing, of growing up without their mother while the world whispered that she had simply walked away from them. For Marcus, it was the private hell of a man who had gotten away with something terrible, who lived every day with the fear that his secret would surface. But there was a third hell, one that no one knew about. It was the hell that Leslie Prior endured in a place no one thought to look. To understand what happened to Leslie, we need to go back to that afternoon in May. When Marcus caught her trying to leave, when the struggle moved from the house to the front yard and back inside again, something shifted in him. The carefully maintained facade of the successful businessman cracked, revealing the monster beneath. He couldn't let Leslie leave. She knew too much about his financial dealings, his affairs, his plans. If she got to a lawyer, if she started talking, his entire carefully constructed life would collapse. In those desperate moments, Marcus made a decision that would define the next 2 decades. He had a friend, a man named Victor Drayton, who operated on the margins of society. Victor had helped Marcus with certain business matters before, deals that couldn't stand up to legal scrutiny. Marcus called Victor, and within hours, a plan was set in motion. Leslie was taken from her home that day, drugged and transported to a property Victor owned in rural Oregon. It was a remote farmhouse, isolated from neighbors, perfect for keeping someone hidden. When Leslie woke up, she found herself in a locked room with bars on the windows, and Victor's cold face explained her new reality. She was to stay there, invisible and forgotten, while the world moved on without her. The first months were the hardest. Leslie screamed herself hoarse, pounded on the walls until her fists bled, tried every method of escape she could imagine. But the room was secure, the property was isolated, and Victor was always watching. He wasn't cruel, not in the way Marcus had been. He was simply indifferent, treating Leslie like a package he had been paid to store, nothing more. Leslie's only connection to the outside world was a small television Victor allowed her to have, and through it, she watched her own missing person case fade from the news. She saw Marcus give tearful interviews, saw her children grow up in photographs released by the media, saw the world conclude that Leslie Prior had probably wandered off in a state of mental disturbance and met some tragic end. The first year was about survival. Leslie forced herself to eat, to exercise in the small space she was given, to maintain her physical health even as her hope faded. She had no idea if rescue would ever come, but some stubborn part of her refused to give up entirely. She wrote in journals Victor occasionally provided, filling them with memories of her children, with plans for what she would do if she ever got free, with rage at the man who had stolen her life. The second year was about adaptation. Leslie learned Victor's routines, his habits, his weaknesses. She studied him like a subject in a book, looking for vulnerabilities she might exploit. She discovered that Victor was not as loyal to Marcus as he appeared. There was resentment there, a sense that he was underpaid for the risk he was taking. Leslie filed this information away, knowing it might be useful someday. By the third year, Leslie had developed a strange kind of routine. Victor had relaxed some of the restrictions, allowing her limited access to the rest of the farmhouse, though the doors and windows remained secured. She cooked meals, cleaned the house, and in exchange, Victor treated her with a rough kind of courtesy. It was Stockholm Syndrome inverted, a captor growing comfortable with his captive. But Leslie never forgot who she was or what had been done to her. She never stopped looking for opportunities, never stopped hoping. And in her 5th year of captivity, an opportunity finally appeared. Victor had a weakness, alcohol. When he drank, he talked, and when he talked, he revealed things he shouldn't. One night, deep in his cups, he mentioned that Marcus had stopped paying the agreed-upon monthly fee for Leslie's imprisonment. The payments had become irregular, then stopped entirely. Victor was angry, feeling used and discarded. Leslie saw her opening and took it. She began to work on Victor, slowly, carefully, planting seeds of doubt and resentment. She reminded him that if Leslie was ever discovered, Victor would go to prison while Marcus would use his money and connections to escape consequences. She suggested that maybe there was a way they could both benefit from this situation, a way that didn't involve keeping her locked up forever. It took 2 more years, but eventually, Victor came to see Leslie not as a prisoner, but as an ally. Marcus had betrayed him, and Victor wanted revenge. Leslie wanted freedom. Their interests aligned. In 2008, Victor helped Leslie escape from the farmhouse. But he didn't simply let her go. Instead, they formed an unlikely partnership, united by their shared enemy. Leslie spent the next several years rebuilding her life in the shadows, gathering resources, and planning for the day when she would confront the man who had destroyed her. She worked under assumed names, taking jobs that paid cash and didn't ask questions. She saved money, rebuilt her strength, and most importantly, she documented everything Victor knew about Marcus's illegal activities. The financial fraud, the money laundering, the bribery of officials. Marcus had been dirty for years, and Victor had been privy to many of his secrets. By 2010, Leslie Prior had transformed from a victim into something else entirely, a ghost with a mission. She had no legal identity, no social security number, no way to simply walk back into her old life. But she had evidence, determination, and a patient fury that had been building for a decade. The years between 2010 and 2020 were Leslie's wilderness period. She existed in the margins of society, moving from city to city, working jobs that didn't require background checks, always watching for any sign that Marcus or his associates were looking for her. But they weren't. As far as the world was concerned, Leslie Prior was dead, just another cold case file gathering dust in a police station basement. During this time, Leslie tracked her children as best she could. The internet made it possible to follow their lives from a distance, and what she saw both comforted and broke her heart. Emma had graduated high school, then college, becoming a social worker who specialized in domestic abuse cases. Leslie wondered if some part of her daughter remembered, if the experience of having a mother who disappeared had shaped her career choice. Michael had struggled more, dropping out of college and battling with substance abuse before eventually getting clean and starting a small landscaping business. Both children had grown into adults without her, and Leslie grieved for every milestone she had missed. Marcus, meanwhile, had thrived. He had remarried in 2005 to a woman 20 years his junior. He had expanded his business empire, becoming one of the most prominent businessmen in the region. He sat on charity boards, donated to politicians, and cultivated an image as a pillar of the community. The concerned husband whose troubled wife had vanished had transformed into a beloved local figure. It was enough to make Leslie sick with rage. But she had learned patience in that farmhouse, learned to wait for the right moment. And she knew that moment hadn't arrived yet. The thing that finally set everything in motion was a stroke of luck, or perhaps fate. In 2019, Leslie was living in Portland, working as a night cleaner at an office building. One evening, she was emptying trash cans when she recognized a face on a magazine cover in one of the offices. It was Marcus, featured in a business publication as a titan of industry. But that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the smaller text below, mentioning that Marcus was being considered for a major political appointment, a position that would require extensive background checks and media scrutiny. Leslie knew that if Marcus got that appointment, he would become untouchable. The connections and protection that came with government positions would put him beyond her reach forever. She had to act now, had to find a way to expose him before he ascended to that level of power. She reached out to Victor, who was living in Mexico under a false name. He had become something of a friend over the years, bound to Leslie by their shared history and their mutual hatred of Marcus. Victor had evidence that could destroy Marcus, documents, and recordings that proved his involvement in financial crimes. But using that evidence would mean exposing Victor's own role, and he was reluctant to take that risk. Leslie spent months persuading him, reminding him that Marcus had left him to rot, that the man deserved to face justice. Eventually, Victor agreed. With one condition: Leslie had to be the face of the revelation. She had to come back from the dead. It was a terrifying prospect. Leslie had spent nearly 2 decades as a ghost, invisible and forgotten. Stepping back into the light meant confronting everything she had lost, facing the children who thought she had abandoned them, and becoming the center of a media firestorm. But she knew it was the only way. In early 2020, Leslie began preparing for her return. She contacted Patricia Chun, the lawyer who had tried to help her all those years ago, and was stunned to learn that Patricia was still practicing, still specializing in cases of domestic abuse. Patricia was initially skeptical, unable to believe that the woman on the phone was the same Leslie Prieur who had vanished in 2001. But when Leslie provided details that only she could know, Patricia's skepticism turned to shock, then to fierce determination. Together, they developed a plan. Patricia would reach out to a journalist she trusted, someone with a reputation for investigating powerful figures. Leslie would provide her story and the evidence Victor had gathered, and then they would watch Marcus Prieur's carefully constructed world come crashing down. The journalist's name was Michael Torres, an investigative reporter who had built his career exposing corruption. When Patricia first approached him with the story, he thought it was too incredible to be true. A woman held captive for years, a prominent businessman hiding a history of abuse and fraud, evidence of crimes that stretched back decades. It sounded like a movie, not real life. But when Michael met Leslie, when he saw the documents and heard the recordings, when he cross-referenced dates and verified details, he realized he had stumbled onto the story of a lifetime. He spent months investigating, building a case that would be unassailable, preparing for the moment when he would confront Marcus Prieur with the truth. That moment came in November 2020. Michael Torres published his exposé on a Sunday morning, timing it to dominate the news cycle. The headline was simple: "From the Grave, the Leslie Prieur Story." The article detailed everything: Marcus's financial crimes, his abuse of Leslie, his plot to have her committed, the conspiracy to keep her imprisoned for years. It included photographs, documents, and recordings that left no room for doubt. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, Marcus Prieur went from beloved businessman to suspected criminal. The political appointment he had been seeking was immediately withdrawn. His business partners began distancing themselves. His wife filed for divorce. And in the center of the storm stood Leslie Prieur, returned from the dead, ready to face her past and claim her future. The weeks following the exposé were chaos. Leslie found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never wanted, surrounded by media attention and public scrutiny. Every news outlet wanted her story. Every talk show wanted her as a guest. She gave a handful of carefully selected interviews, sharing her experience with grace and dignity, refusing to let Marcus's narrative define her any longer. The legal machinery began to move. Prosecutors opened investigations into Marcus's financial crimes, and the evidence Victor had provided gave them everything they needed. Leslie herself was questioned extensively, her account of her captivity verified and documented. Victor, true to his agreement with Leslie, provided testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence on his own crimes. But for Leslie, the most important confrontation wasn't with prosecutors or journalists. It was with her children. Emma and Michael had spent 19 years believing their mother had abandoned them, had spent those years navigating the complicated grief of losing a parent to ambiguous circumstances. Now they had to process the truth, that their mother had been taken from them, that their father was a monster, that everything they thought they knew about their family was a lie. Emma reached out first. She called Leslie on a cold December morning, her voice shaking with emotion. The conversation lasted 3 hours, filled with tears, questions, and the beginning of healing. Emma had always suspected something was wrong about the official story of her mother's disappearance, had always felt that the father everyone admired was hiding something dark. Learning the truth was devastating, but it was also a strange kind of relief, validation of instincts she had suppressed for years. Michael's reaction was more complicated. He had struggled more after Leslie's disappearance, his substance abuse problems partially rooted in the trauma of losing his mother. He felt rage at Marcus, of course, but also guilt. He had loved his father, had defended him against whispers and suspicions, had believed the story that his mother was mentally unstable. Learning that he had been manipulated for years, that his loyalty had been given to a monster, was almost too much to bear. The first meeting between Leslie and her adult children took place on Christmas Eve, 2020. Patricia arranged for them to use her office, a neutral space where they could have privacy. Leslie arrived early, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. She had imagined this moment for years, had dreamed of holding her children again. But she also knew that the children she had known were gone, replaced by adults shaped by trauma and time. When Emma walked through the door, Leslie saw glimpses of the teenager she had left behind, but also a strong, capable woman who had survived her own trials. When Michael followed, Leslie saw the shadow of pain in his eyes, the scars of years of self-destruction. But she also saw hope, a cautious willingness to believe in something good again. They talked for hours. Leslie told them everything, every detail of her captivity, every moment she had spent thinking about them, every dream she had held onto in the darkest times. Emma and Michael shared their own stories, the years of therapy and struggle, the questions that had never been answered. They cried together, mourned together, and began the long process of rebuilding a family from the wreckage Marcus had left behind. By the time they parted that night, something fundamental had shifted. They weren't the family they had been before, couldn't be the family they had been before. But they were a family still, connected by bonds that even 19 years of separation couldn't completely sever. The legal proceedings against Marcus dragged on through 2021. His lawyers employed every delaying tactic available, arguing jurisdiction, questioning evidence, and attacking Leslie's credibility at every opportunity. Marcus himself maintained his innocence publicly, claiming he was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by a mentally ill wife and a disgruntled former employee. But the evidence was overwhelming, and in September 2021, Marcus Prier was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and unlawful imprisonment. The trial was scheduled for early 2022, and prosecutors were confident of conviction. For Leslie, watching Marcus finally face consequences was bittersweet. No amount of legal punishment could give her back the years she had lost, the moments with her children she had missed, the life that had been stolen from her. But there was satisfaction in seeing the mask finally stripped away, in watching the community that had admired Marcus come to understand what he truly was. She spent the months before the trial healing. She underwent therapy, processing trauma that had been pushed down for decades. She rebuilt her legal identity, navigating the bureaucratic nightmare of proving she was still alive. And she began to imagine, for the first time in years, what a future might look like. The trial of Marcus Prier began in February 2022 and quickly became one of the most watched legal proceedings in the country. Cameras were allowed in the courtroom, and millions of viewers tuned in to watch the downfall of a man who had hidden his crimes behind a polished facade for decades. Leslie testified for 3 days. She sat in the witness stand and told her story, from the beginning of her marriage to the moment of her escape. Marcus's lawyers tried to shake her, to find inconsistencies, to paint her as unstable or unreliable. But Leslie was unshakable. 19 years of captivity had given her a core of steel that no amount of cross-examination could crack. Victor Drayden testified as well, his account corroborating Leslie's in every detail. He described how Marcus had hired him, how the payments had been made, how the conspiracy had been maintained for years. He showed no remorse for his own role, but he showed no protection for Marcus either. His testimony was damning. The most powerful moment came when Emma took the stand. She wasn't required to testify against her father, but she had chosen to do so, driven by a need to speak her truth. She described growing up in a household ruled by fear, the way her father had controlled and manipulated everyone around him, the damage that his cruelty had done to her family. Her voice broke several times, but she never stopped speaking. Marcus, watching from the defense table, showed no emotion throughout the trial. He had built a lifetime of practice in hiding his true self, and even now, facing the consequences of his actions, he maintained the mask. But as the evidence mounted, as witness after witness described his crimes, something in him seemed to shrink. The confident businessman who had entered the courtroom became smaller with each passing day. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned their verdict, the courtroom fell silent. The foreperson read the charges one by one, and for each count, the verdict was the same: guilty. Marcus Prier was convicted on all charges. He was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. As he was led away in handcuffs, Leslie sat in the gallery with Emma and Michael on either side of her. There were no cheers, no celebrations, just a quiet sense of closure, of justice finally served. After the trial, Leslie began the next chapter of her life. She moved to a small house near Emma, establishing the proximity she had longed for during all those years of captivity. Michael visited often, his relationship with his mother deepening as they both worked to heal from their shared trauma. Patricia Chun, who had been with Leslie since the beginning, became a close friend and trusted advisor. Leslie also became an advocate. She spoke publicly about domestic abuse, about the tactics abusers use to control their victims, about the importance of believing women who come forward with their stories. Her experience gave her a unique platform, and she used it to help others who were trapped in situations like the one she had escaped. In 2023, Leslie published a memoir. It detailed her experience in full, holding nothing back. The book became a bestseller, its proceeds funding a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping survivors of domestic abuse rebuild their lives. Leslie had transformed her suffering into something meaningful, a legacy that would help others long after she was gone. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was the simplest one. Leslie Prier, who had spent 19 years as a ghost, was visible again. She walked down streets without hiding her face, introduced herself with her real name, and lived each day as the woman she had always been. She had been erased from the world once, and she had written herself back into existence through sheer force of will. It's now 2024, more than 2 decades since Leslie Prier disappeared from her home on Maple Drive. As I sit here today, I can still remember the woman I was before that spring afternoon in 2001. The woman who had been worn down to nothing by years of abuse and manipulation. That woman seems like a stranger to me now, a ghost from another life. I am often asked how I survived, how I maintained hope through 19 years of captivity. The answer is complicated, but it comes down to one thing: love. I loved my children with a ferocity that nothing could diminish, not even years of separation. I held on to that love in the darkest moments, used it as a compass to find my way back to myself. And when I finally emerged from the darkness, that love was still there, waiting to be rekindled. Emma is thriving now. She has become a director at the organization I founded, using her professional expertise to help survivors in ways I never could. She has a partner, a kind woman named Sarah, and they're talking about adoption. My daughter, who grew up without her mother, wants to give a home to children who need one. The symmetry of that brings me more joy than I can express. Michael is doing well too. He's been sober for 5 years, the longest stretch of his adult life. His landscaping business has grown, and he's hired other men in recovery, giving them the second chances he was given. We talk every Sunday, sometimes for hours, making up for all the conversations we missed. He told me recently that for years, he was angry at me for leaving. Now he's just grateful I came back. Marcus died in prison last year. Heart attack, they said, brought on by years of stress and declining health. I felt nothing when I heard the news. He had taken so much from me, but I had refused to let him take my capacity for joy, my ability to love, my sense of self. In the end, he died alone, abandoned by the world he had tried so hard to deceive. I died and came back to life, surrounded by family and friends. That is the only victory that matters. I am 78 years old now, and I have lived two lives. The first was marked by fear, by silence, by a slow erasure of everything that made me who I was. The second is marked by freedom, by voice, by the slow rebuilding of everything that was taken from me. If I had to choose, I would not wish my experience on anyone. But I have come to understand that our greatest tragedies can become our greatest strengths if we have the courage to transform them. The story of Leslie Prior is not just my story. It is the story of every woman who has been told she is worthless, every victim who has been silenced by the systems that should protect her, every survivor who has clawed their way back from the abyss. If my story reaches even one person trapped in a situation like mine, if it gives even one victim the courage to fight back, then everything I endured will have meaning. I started this story by asking you what you would do if you discovered the person who claimed to love you was planning to destroy you. Now I have another question. What will you do with this story? Will you share it? Not for my sake, but for the sake of someone who might need to hear it? Will you look around at the women in your life and ask yourself if any of them might be suffering in silence? Will you believe them when they finally find the courage to speak? I am Leslie Prior. I was erased from the world for 19 years, but I wrote myself back into existence. I was a victim, but I became a survivor. I was silenced, but now I speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. And my story, the story you've heard today, is not about what was done to me. It is about what I did in response. Remember that. Remember that no matter how dark the night, no matter how complete the silence, no matter how thorough the erasure, there is always a way back. There is always a chance for justice. There is always hope. And if you're out there right now, trapped in your own prison, visible or invisible, I want you to know, your story doesn't have to end the way your captor wrote it. You have the power to pick up the pen and write a different ending. I did it. And so can you. This is Leslie Prior, signing off. But my story isn't over. It continues in every survivor who hears it and finds the strength to write their own comeback. Subscribe to this channel, share this video, and be part of spreading that strength. Because stories like mine need to be told, and stories like yours deserve to be heard.